On the edge of nowhere, buried under a ruthless winter storm, stood an old, forgotten diner, Everwind. The roads were closed, the power was out, and the biting cold showed no mercy. As the storm howled like a beast outside, 10 truckers, exhausted, starving, and hopeless, found themselves trapped, with nowhere to go. No gas. No food. No signal. But inside that diner stood one man. Not a hero. Not a leader. Just a quiet, aging man named Thomas Carter, working alone behind the counter of a place the world had long stopped noticing. No one expected much of him. In fact, he was invisible to most. But that night, Thomas made a choice. A choice that would defy logic, warm freezing hearts, and remind the world that sometimes, miracles are made not by grand gestures, but by ordinary people who refuse to give up on others. The storm came without warning, fast, cruel, and absolute. By nightfall, the highway was buried under a suffocating white silence, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. At the edge of that forgotten road stood a rundown diner, its faded neon sign sputtering in the blizzard like a dying heartbeat. Inside, the smell of old coffee clung to the walls, and the silence was only broken by the hum of an aging heater struggling against the cold. Behind the counter stood Thomas Carter, a man most had stopped noticing years ago. His back was slightly stooped, his hands weathered by time and work, but his eyes still carried the quiet intensity of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. Once a long-haul driver himself, Thomas knew what it meant to be stranded, forgotten in the dark corners of the world where no help ever came. As the snow thickened outside and emergency broadcasts warned of road closures and power failures, the diner slowly became a place of refuge. One by one, trucks rolled in, engines dying, headlights dimming. 10 drivers, each worn and weary, took shelter in the only light they could find. They didn't come asking for kindness, just a warm place to wait out the storm. But Thomas saw something else in their tired eyes: desperation, fear, and a quiet plea for something more than survival. The shelves were nearly empty. The generator sputtered. He could have closed the door, said it was out of his hands. But Thomas didn't. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and did what no one expected. He boiled water. He opened the last of his canned food. He found blankets in the back storage he hadn't touched in years. And as the night deepened and the storm roared louder, he moved from truck to truck in the blinding snow, bringing hot soup in cracked mugs and quiet words that felt warmer than fire. He was an old man with nothing left to prove. But that night, in the heart of the storm, Thomas Carter became something more than a diner owner. He became a lifeline. And though the world outside remained frozen and unforgiving, inside that tiny diner, something rare was born: human decency in its purest form. The storm outside howled like a living, breathing entity. It lashed against the walls of the diner with the ferocity of a beast, its icy tendrils creeping in through every crack and crevice. The windows trembled in their frames as the wind sent blasts of snow and ice swirling against them, creating a constant hiss like a snake waiting to strike. Inside, the warm yellow light from the overhead lamp stood in stark contrast to the frozen world outside, yet even here, the chill seemed to have a grip on the room. It crept along the edges, pulling at the warmth that had once filled the air, leaving everyone huddled in tense, quiet discomfort. Thomas stood near the counter, watching as the few remaining patrons tried to make themselves comfortable, their faces drawn and weary. He knew these people. He had seen them pass through here countless times over the years. The truckers, the travelers, the locals, each with their own story, their own weight they carried, their own private battles. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. Tonight, the storm outside seemed to push them all closer together, making their solitude feel more profound, more suffocating. Thomas's own heart was heavy. He hadn't expected to be here, hadn't wanted to. But the diner had always been his refuge. In moments like this, when the world outside was an unforgiving abyss, he could stand behind this counter and lose himself in the rhythm of his actions. The simple, familiar tasks of brewing coffee, serving food, wiping down counters, they grounded him, kept him tethered to reality, to the here and now. But even as his hands moved, his mind raced. The storm, the isolation, the people who had drifted into his life and had yet to leave. He had seen too much, and it was hard not to let it consume him. His own ghosts, the ones he kept locked away, would never truly rest. The door creaked open, sending a rush of cold air into the room. Thomas flinched, his body tense. The gust of wind felt like a slap against his skin, making him shiver involuntarily. When the door swung fully open, a tall figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the harsh white light of the storm. His form was almost swallowed by the darkness and snow, but there was something about the way he moved, graceful, calculated, with a quiet intensity, that caught Thomas's attention. For a moment, the two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff. The newcomer, drenched to the bone with snow clinging to his jacket and hair, seemed to be caught between the need for refuge and the uncertainty of entering the warmth. His eyes darted across the room, pausing briefly on each of the patrons before resting on Thomas. There was a depth in his gaze, a haunted look that made Thomas's breath catch in his chest. It wasn't just the storm that had brought him here, it was something else, something far more personal, something Thomas could recognize all too well. Without a word, Thomas moved towards the door, his boots crunching on the frozen floor as he stepped forward, a quiet gesture of invitation. The newcomer hesitated, but then, as if the weight of the storm had become too much to bear, he stepped inside. The moment the door slammed shut behind him, the temperature inside seemed to drop another degree. Thomas barely registered it, his focus entirely on the man who had just entered. His clothes were soaked, his face pale, his movements stiff and slow as if he were fighting to keep himself upright. The stranger staggered slightly, his eyes closing for a split second, as though he had been holding himself together with sheer willpower. "Hey, take a seat," Thomas said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "I'll get you something warm." The man nodded slowly, his lips barely moving as he murmured a word of thanks. He moved to the nearest booth, his movements sluggish, as if each step took more energy than he had left to give. Thomas followed him, a lingering sense of unease swirling in his chest. The man didn't seem to notice the other patrons, didn't acknowledge the soft chatter or the clinking of silverware. He was in his own world, lost in something that seemed far darker than the storm outside. As Thomas placed a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, he took a step back, his eyes scanning the man's face. The stranger's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the mug, but there was something in his expression that made Thomas hesitate. It wasn't just exhaustion or the cold that had drained him, it was something more. Something unspoken. His eyes, though tired, held an intensity that betrayed a deeper fear, an unspoken anguish that Thomas knew all too well. "You okay?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice laced with both concern and curiosity. He had seen many people come and go through this diner, but this man, there was something different about him. The way he held himself. The way his eyes flickered with that almost imperceptible fear. The man took a slow sip from the mug, his fingers trembling. He didn't answer immediately, as if the question had caught him off guard. He didn't seem to know how to respond. But eventually, he met Thomas's gaze, his eyes shadowed with a quiet pain that no amount of warmth or food could heal. "I don't know if I'm going to make it through this," his voice cracked, low and rough, as if saying the words aloud made the reality of them more real. His eyes darted to the window, as if the storm outside held the answers he needed, as if it held the way out. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He knew that feeling. The sense of being trapped, not just by the weather, but by something deeper, something that gnawed at you when you weren't paying attention. It was a feeling Thomas had been running from for years, a feeling that had never quite left him. The need to escape, to find a way out, to stop the ache that kept pulling at your insides. "We'll make it through," Thomas said, the words coming out more as a promise than a reassurance. His gaze softened as he placed a hand on the edge of the booth, steadying himself as much as the man before him. "We always do." The man didn't reply. Instead, he took another sip of the coffee, his eyes focused on the steam rising from the mug. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the world was a fragile, quiet place. They both knew that. And maybe, just maybe, that shared understanding was enough to keep them both from unraveling completely. The silence between Thomas and the stranger felt like a heavy blanket, one that wrapped itself around the two men and held them captive. The clinking of coffee cups and the distant hum of the diner's refrigerator seemed far away, swallowed by the weight of the unspoken words hanging in the air. Thomas could feel the tension radiating from the stranger, a tightness that was almost suffocating. It wasn't just the chill of the storm outside that seemed to have settled into his bones, it was something deeper, something far more painful. Thomas studied the man closely, noting the way his hands shook slightly as they gripped the coffee mug, his knuckles white with tension. The stranger's dark eyes were unfocused, staring into the black liquid as though it held the answers to questions he didn't want to ask. His face was drawn, the faintest traces of stubble darkening his jawline, and his hair was tousled in a way that spoke of long, restless nights. There was a haunted look in his eyes, a look that said he was far from being here, in this diner, in this moment. He was somewhere else, somewhere darker. The stranger let out a soft, shaky breath, but it didn't seem to help. His chest still felt tight, constricted, as if something heavy was lodged inside him, something he couldn't expel no matter how hard he tried. His gaze flickered toward Thomas, their eyes locking for a split second before the stranger quickly looked away. But it was enough to see it, the fear, the confusion, the shame. There was something he wasn't saying, something he wasn't ready to confront. And it gnawed at Thomas, making him feel like he was standing on the edge of something deep, something painful. Thomas could feel the stranger's hesitation, his reluctance to open up, and, for a moment, he hesitated too. He wasn't one for prying into people's lives. It wasn't in his nature to force someone to talk about their pain when they weren't ready. But something about this man, something about the rawness in his eyes, made Thomas want to reach out, to offer some comfort, even if it was only a small gesture. "You don't have to say anything you're not ready for," Thomas said quietly, his voice gentle, laced with understanding. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the stranger's. "But, whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Thomas wondered if he had said too much. But then, slowly, the stranger's hands relaxed around his mug, his fingers loosening just a fraction. He exhaled, the sound low and heavy, like a man who had been holding his breath for far too long. The man's gaze shifted, this time lingering on Thomas, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. He looked like he was searching for something, some kind of answer, but he wasn't sure what. The stranger's voice was soft, almost a whisper, as he finally spoke, his words jagged and broken, as though they had been caught in his throat for far too long. "I thought I could fix things," he murmured, his voice rough and raw, like gravel scraping against metal. "I thought, if I just tried harder, if I just kept pushing, maybe I could make it right. But I was wrong. I lost everything. And now, I don't know how to move forward. I don't know where to go from here." Thomas's heart tightened at the words. He could hear the defeat in the stranger's voice, the resignation that came from someone who had fought too many battles and lost far too many times. It wasn't just the storm outside that had broken him, it was something deeper, something that felt like it had been building for years, maybe even a lifetime. "I know what it's like," Thomas said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotions rising inside him. "To feel like you've lost everything. Like you're standing at the edge of a cliff, with nothing but emptiness in front of you. But that's not the end. It doesn't have to be. You're still here. You've made it through the hardest part, surviving. And sometimes, that's enough to start again." The stranger's eyes met Thomas's, and for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of something, hope, maybe. It was so faint that Thomas almost missed it, but it was there, like a tiny spark in the darkness. The stranger's lips parted, as though he was about to say something more, but then he closed his mouth, swallowing the words. For a long while, the stranger sat there, his hands resting on the counter, unmoving. He was lost in thought, wrestling with the weight of his own turmoil. Thomas watched him, wondering if he had said the right thing, if anything he had said had made a difference. But the man didn't move, didn't speak, only stared down at the coffee in front of him, as though it were the only thing that could offer him any kind of solace. Finally, the stranger stood up, slowly, as though it took all his strength just to rise from the seat. He gave Thomas a long, searching look, his eyes softening just a little. The weight in his expression had shifted, ever so slightly, from hopelessness to something else, something more open, more willing to accept that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. "Maybe you're right," the stranger said quietly, his voice still rough, but with a hint of resolve behind it. "Maybe I've been too afraid to even try. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Maybe I'll start over." Thomas nodded, a small, understanding smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "One step at a time," he said, his voice steady, offering the man a silent promise that, no matter how dark things seemed, there was always the possibility of light, if only they were willing to look for it. As the stranger turned to leave, Thomas watched him, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over him. The man had come in as a shadow of his former self, but now, there was a spark of something different. A flicker of hope. And for the first time, the storm outside didn't feel quite as oppressive. The wind howled, but inside the diner, the world felt just a little bit brighter. The door to the diner creaked open with a heavy groan, as if the storm outside was trying to force its way in. A gust of cold wind rushed through the space, ruffling the stacks of napkins on the counter, and carrying with it the scent of wet pavement and the promise of a night that refused to be still. Thomas watched through half-lidded eyes as the stranger, his silhouette momentarily framed by the dim streetlight outside, stepped into the storm. A fleeting glance, a sharp, deliberate movement, and then the man disappeared into the thick, howling wind. For a long moment, Thomas stayed frozen at the counter, his fingertips grazing the rim of his now cold coffee cup. His mind replayed the brief interaction with the man, the look in his eyes, the kind of raw, unfiltered pain that could only come from years of hidden burdens. It was the kind of thing that made a person feel small, invisible. But somehow, in that fleeting moment when their gazes had met, Thomas had felt something shift. The stranger hadn't spoken much, but the way he carried himself when he walked out, the way his shoulders, ever so slightly, squared up, spoke volumes. It was almost imperceptible, but in the quiet space of the diner, Thomas saw it. A subtle but unmistakable shift from defeat to resolve. It had been so brief, like a spark in a sea of darkness, but Thomas couldn't ignore it. His own reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, haggard, worn, and tired. He had been waiting for something like this for a long time, a moment that could fill the emptiness, the ache that seemed to linger in his chest, no matter how much time passed. But nothing ever came, did it? Life just kept moving. Another gust of wind rattled the door, and Thomas glanced up at the sound. He felt the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, but before he could get lost in them again, the bell above the door jingled. A soft sound, almost lost against the backdrop of the rain's pounding rhythm. He lifted his gaze, a habit that had become instinctive in the last few years, and saw a young woman standing at the door, looking lost. Her umbrella dripped heavily, as though it had given up its fight against the storm. Her face was partially hidden beneath the damp strands of hair clinging to her forehead, but there was something about her that caught his attention. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the diner like she wasn't entirely sure she belonged here, but then her gaze locked onto Thomas's. A small, fleeting moment passed between them, two strangers, separated by only a few feet and yet, somehow, united in a shared silence. Thomas noticed the exhaustion in her posture, the weight she was carrying that seemed too heavy for anyone, let alone a person so young. He instinctively reached for a clean mug and poured some coffee, offering it with a quiet gesture. "Rough night?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had asked the question far too many times before. She gave a small, rueful smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You could say that," she replied, her voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break something fragile within her. She moved toward the counter, the soft click of her boots against the tile echoing in the otherwise quiet space. "It's like the world is turning in a way that doesn't make any sense." "Nothing's right." Thomas nodded. He recognized that feeling, more than he cared to admit. It was the kind of night where the weight of life presses down so hard that it feels like breathing is a choice, not a necessity. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the counter, watching her with quiet empathy. There was a tension in her posture that told him she wasn't looking for sympathy. Not that kind of sympathy. She didn't need a shoulder to cry on, she needed to figure out how to carry whatever it was that had been thrust upon her. "It's a tough place to be," Thomas said quietly, almost to himself. He had been there once, too many times, in fact, wondering if he could hold on just long enough to find some kind of peace. But even peace seemed so distant now. Still, there was something about her that made him feel like he wasn't alone in this world, even if only for a moment. The woman's gaze shifted to the window, her brow furrowing as she stared out into the rain. She looked like she was searching for something, some glimmer of hope or direction, perhaps, in the endless dark curtain of water falling outside. "I don't even know what I'm doing here," she murmured, half to herself. "I've been running for so long. I don't know where I'm going anymore." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. There was something about her vulnerability that stirred something inside of Thomas, something that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He had built walls, high and thick, around everything that mattered, but seeing her here, with all her unspoken fears, made him wonder if maybe he had shut himself off too much. "Sometimes," Thomas said slowly, his voice steady, "the hardest part is admitting that you don't have the answers. But that doesn't mean you can't find your way." The woman turned back to face him, her eyes searching his face. She seemed to study him for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't just speaking to her. He was speaking to himself too, reminding himself that he still had the ability to move forward, even if it was just one small step at a time. She let out a shaky breath, nodding as if accepting the quiet wisdom in his words, but still, she didn't say much. She simply wrapped her fingers around the coffee mug he'd set in front of her, the warmth seeming to seep into her, though it couldn't touch the coldness in her eyes. Yet, for the briefest moment, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the comfort of the space around her, even if she wasn't quite ready to let go of whatever had been weighing her down. Thomas didn't push her. He understood. He had learned over the years that sometimes, the best thing to do was simply offer a quiet presence, a space where someone could feel safe long enough to gather the courage to take the next step. And in that moment, he knew she wasn't as lost as she had been when she first walked in. She had taken the first step towards something, he wasn't sure what, but it was something. And maybe, just maybe, it was a step toward finding peace, toward finding her way. The rain continued to fall outside, its rhythm steady and persistent, and in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the diner and the soft clinking of coffee mugs, Thomas realized that for once, the storm didn't feel quite as overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't just the rain that could wash away the weight of everything. The storm outside had intensified, the rain now a steady rhythm against the diner windows. It was as if the world outside had mirrored the turmoil inside the small, dimly lit space. The faint glow from the neon sign flickered occasionally, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance across the room. Inside, the diner was quiet, save for the soft clink of cutlery and the low hum of the jukebox in the corner. The air was thick with unspoken tension, but beneath it all, a strange sense of stillness had taken hold. Thomas sat there, not rushing, not pressing. He watched her, his eyes tracing the way her fingers gripped the mug, her knuckles turning white. She was trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something she carried with her. The faintest tremor passed through her hands as she slowly lifted the mug to her lips, her eyes momentarily fixed on the steam swirling up. Her gaze seemed distant, as if lost somewhere far beyond the confines of this small diner, lost in a place only she knew. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of their own thoughts. Thomas, though quiet, felt a surge of empathy. Her vulnerability hung in the air like a fragile thread, ready to snap if pulled too hard. He recognized it because he had lived it. There were times in his life when all he had been able to do was escape, to run, to keep moving because facing what was coming would be too much to bear. He had spent years looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day the past would catch up to him. She sighed, a soft sound, almost imperceptible. Her shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible weight, her body language shifting from tense to weary. Slowly, almost as though it pained her to admit it, she spoke. I wasn't sure if I'd find someone to turn to. Her voice was raw, like it hadn't been used in a long time. There was a vulnerability in the way the words slipped out, almost like she hadn't intended to say them at all. It was as if the words were fighting their way out of a prison she had kept them locked in for far too long. I didn't think there was anyone who could understand. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest. His instincts screamed to reach out, to comfort her, but he held back, understanding that sometimes, the most meaningful thing you could do was to allow someone to speak, to release the pressure that had been building within them for so long. He leaned forward just slightly, his elbows resting on the counter, his gaze steady but gentle. His words came out in a low murmur, careful not to overwhelm her, but he meant every syllable. Sometimes, we don't know where to go. And sometimes, it feels like we're the only ones who don't have the answers. But you're not alone in that. Her eyes flickered up to meet his, and in that fleeting moment, he saw something change, like the smallest crack in a wall she had built around herself. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She had heard him. She had understood. She bit her lip, the hesitation clear in her eyes. Then, with a breath that seemed to draw something from the deepest part of her, she spoke again, this time her voice firmer, though still fragile. I don't even know what I'm running from anymore, she whispered, her words punctuated by a soft laugh that didn't reach her eyes. I thought if I kept moving, I'd outrun it. But now, I don't even know where to go. Or if there's anywhere left to run. Thomas watched her, feeling the weight of her words settle like a heavy fog in the space between them. He could feel the sharp edge of her pain, the isolation she had wrapped herself in. It was a feeling he knew well, the sense of being trapped in your own skin, your own mind, with nowhere to hide from the things that haunted you. The things you couldn't shake no matter how far you ran. He sat back, his hands folded in front of him. His voice dropped to a softer, more reflective tone as he spoke. "Sometimes, running isn't the answer," he said, his words thoughtful, as though speaking more to himself than to her. "We think it's easier to run, but eventually, it catches up. And when it does, we're left standing face to face with it, just as vulnerable as we were when we started." She turned her head slightly, as if considering his words, her gaze lost for a moment in the steaming mug before her. There was a shift in her expression, a subtle softening, like the idea was beginning to take root in her mind. "And what if I don't know how to stop?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as though she were afraid of the answer. Thomas let the silence hang between them, feeling the weight of her question. He had asked himself the same thing countless times in his life. The fear of facing everything that was too painful to confront. But he had learned something along the way, that the first step was the hardest, but it was also the most freeing. "Then you take it one step at a time," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to know the whole way. Just the next step. That's all any of us can do." She met his gaze then, truly meeting it, and for a moment, the weight between them seemed to lift, just a little. Her shoulders relaxed, and the tightness in her face eased. It was a small change, but it felt like a shift in the right direction. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say more, but the words seemed to hang in her chest, caught in that place where the unspoken truths lived. Instead, she simply nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Maybe," she said softly, almost as if testing the idea. "Maybe it's time to stop running." Thomas gave her a small, reassuring smile, the first real one he'd offered all night. "It's a good place to start." The rain continued to pour outside, its rhythm steady and unrelenting, but inside, there was a quiet sense of resolution settling in, not just between them, but within her. The storm was still there, but maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to weather it. In this small diner, under the dim lights and the soft hum of the jukebox, two people, each carrying their own burdens, found, for a moment, a shared understanding. And for that brief second, they weren't alone. By the time the snow melted, the world had taken notice. But Thomas Carter didn't do it for the headlines. He didn't do it for recognition. He gave away everything he had, every last can of food, every drop of warmth, every bit of strength in his tired hands, not because he had plenty, but because others had nothing. The 10 truckers who survived that brutal storm never forgot the man who kept them alive with soup, firewood, and silent courage. Years later, when the town tried to shut down the Everwind Diner for good, those truckers returned, not just with money, but with a promise that the place where they were saved would never disappear. Today, the Everwind Diner is more than just a roadside stop. It is a living memory. A quiet monument to selflessness. A place that reminds us all that even when the world forgets you, your kindness can echo through the lives you touch. Because heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes, they just wear aprons and stand alone in the cold.